today to HR Recruit's webinar, which is called Rethinking Resilience at Work, Thriving Beyond Burnout and Disaster Fatigue. My name's Jo Thompson and I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Tamsin Ratcliffe, who's going to be sharing her knowledge about resilience, and hope that you learn a few things today that you can take away with you. The webinar will be a little interactive, and we encourage you to share your thoughts and ask any questions during the session using the chat box facility. I'm now going to hand you over to Tamsin, who will introduce herself and start the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jo. I'm just going to check you can see my screen. Everybody?
Yeah.
So welcome everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here, and thanks, Jo, for the invitation. Just a little bit of background on me. I work for a charity called the Impact Trust. Our focus is really over the last 10 years been looking at sustainability leadership, resilience, transformation, particularly with a focus on resilience building strategies in organizational company contexts. So much so that I have been doing a PhD on this, and this is some of the work that really the understanding that's come out of that. So as Jo said, it is going to be interactive, and I'd really love you to feedback your thoughts, and we're going to use Mentimeter. Hopefully you're all familiar with it, but if you open on a separate window, you can see the address up there, menti.com. And as we go, there'll be places for you to add in your own thinking. So really about the session, what are we going to do? We're going to look at what resilience means for people at work collectively, how we understand it, how it shows up for us and for others, and really how we can start thinking about designing it into human resource management. And I think all of us would agree that it's probably become more relevant in these last few years than less. And you know, this audience, particularly as HR practitioners, have often been in the middle of a very tightening spot, but also equally now have, I think, a very strong opportunity for advocacy and for driving strategic change in companies. So that's what we're about. But before we go, I'm going to ask you to just put in your name and where you are in the world, just so we know who's in the room. So if you go into menti.com and you use the code 8619, I'll put the link in the chat as well. You should have the opportunity to literally put in your words, your name and where you are in the world, and just test that this is working for you, so that we can all get going. Please go ahead and Anna, hi, great. Esther, hello. Exeter. Three of you so far. 28 of us in the room. Please don't feel shy. James, thank you. Hi, nice to see you. So we're pretty much a UK audience today, it looks like. Hi, Susan. Great, Harriet, hello. Susan again. So just if anybody has got any problems, do say now. Welcome, Newcastle. Great. Seems to be hopefully working for a lot of you. Melissa, hello. Juliet. Leanne, hi. Claire, see you. And Marie. Katie, hello. Nice to see you. Jo, see you down there. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Hopefully you all got this working for you. If you have a problem, please enter in the chat that you do, because we're obviously going to be using this a little bit throughout. So I'd love to know just quickly, what are your expectations for today? You know, do you want to discuss this, just have fun? Is there going to be a test at the end that you want to do? Just to get a quick sense of the room, if you wouldn't mind, just quickly put that in. If you press the next slide on your Mentimeter, you should be able to get to this one. Thanks, Anna-Marie. Looking to learn a lot. Okay. Is everybody managing to get to the second Mentimeter? Oh, there we go. Looks like, right. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have some fun as well as learn something. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Okay, my next quick question. So if you press to the next one on the Mentimeter, you should get to this next one. How much do you know? How much would you say you know about resilience already? Quite a lot. You've heard the word. I think we all probably know the word. I mean, it's become the word of the year for the last 4 years. Okay, so everybody knows something. Great. So here I'd like you to just reflect on yourself, whatever you may know, whether you've heard the word, how have you heard it. When you think about yourself in your life, what does resilience mean to you? If you were to think about how would you show you had resilience, how would it manifest in you? What would the word or words or phrase come to mind, thinking about you? Determination and keeping going. Optimism. Dealing with difficulties and recover. Yeah. Coping well. Yeah. Bouncing back. Ability to bounce back. Bounce back ability. Strength. Yep. Coping strategies. So coping, recovering, bouncing back, keeping going. Managing emotion. Coping again comes up. Overcoming. Yeah. So the bigger the word is, the more of you are putting it in. These words are all sensitive. So even if somebody's put in a word, if that is a word that comes to mind, feel free to also enter it. You can see determination and coping are clearly coping strategies. Coping is obviously there in many ways. Keeping things in proportion. I see the end of your word on that one. I see that you cut off on characters, but definitely keeping a sense of proportion. Dealing with stresses. Okay. So I think there's a lot of synergy in what we're thinking about. Managing emotions come up again. Now, I'd like you to take a moment and think beyond yourself. Think of your context at work. Think about your colleagues, thinking about your family. In the context of your community, whether that's your work team or your family home or your neighborhood community, what would resilience mean there? Is there anything else would be the same? What are the words that come up for you? Sustainability. Hand in glove these days, sustainability and resilience. Yeah. Anyone else? Strength, managing, enduring, not breaking down, supporting others. Okay. Thriving in trials. So a lot of similar words to how we see it for ourselves. We're also seeing when we think about others. Getting on with life. My network. Nice to have that there, clearly. When you do think about your colleagues, you think about your network, mutual support. What's coming up a lot? Strength, doggedness. Seeking justice, that's it's an interesting one. Please feel free if to add anything in the chat to any of these phrases if you can't put in enough into this. Ability to have fun, important part of resilience. Yeah. Teamwork, supporting others, sharing information, mutual aid. So I think we're seeing really the connectedness in that, right? Belonging, lovely word, yeah. Perspective. Handle challenges. Great, thank you. So last question for a moment. Which of these would you say is most resilient? An egg, a tomato, tennis ball, a honeybee colony, or a caterpillar? You just had to choose the one that you thought was most resilient. And please put in the chat why you choose what you choose. I'd love to see those comments. I'd love to know who chose the egg and why you think the egg. Please feel free to just put in something here. Working together to produce something great, collaborating. I'm thinking, Sharon, you're talking about the bees, I think. Tennis ball, of course, epitomizes bouncing back. Yeah. Caterpillar, anybody want to share why they're feeling sorry for the tomatoes? Shame, thanks, Jeanette. I have to say, I wonder if there's a day any of us go by without having some tomato in some form in our lives. So I also feel sorry for them, but they don't get unrewarded. Between the tennis ball and bees, but remove the queen bee and the drone doesn't cope. Okay, difficult to choose as all have resilient characteristics. Yeah, I understand that very much. Thank you, Amita. Okay, so if you hold this in mind, then what we're going to really talk about is we're going to talk about what do we mean about resilience, and so let's get to formal definitions such as they are really, and I will talk to you about the backdrops of these two pictures, which you can't quite see, but we'll mention them later. And really, the definition of resilience, so epitomized by the tennis ball, is that it means to bounce back, to rebound, to return to a former position. It's the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape, elasticity, flexibility, or it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. These are the formal definitions of resilience. And we'll talk about as we get through, and if you have any objection to any of these, I'd love to know those as well. And then when we talk about collective resilience, what are we talking about here? Well, here we're talking about a similar capacity, but one that is shared between a community. It's the social bonds or the networks that hold communities together. In companies, you see this obviously in the relationships, in the culture, in the shared practices, in the people who provide the coping mechanisms. And so it is really much more of a supportive structure. And what is interesting is more and more what we see is that the resilience of the collective is interdependent and largely contributory also to the independence of the individual. So these two things are not separate. They are actually more connected than we've seen them be. And over COVID, I suppose this has been demonstrated quite graphically. But in the corporate sector, in the world of talent management or HR management, understanding this how the collective influences the individual and vice versa becomes an essential part of really how we build strong teams. So what I've been particularly looking at over this time are images of resilience. And this is actually based on a book by Gareth Morgan, which is called Images of Organizations. And Gareth Morgan used metaphor as the way to really explore how we presented the image or the nature of our organization. And I think we all know the power of metaphor. We use it all the time. It's a strong component of our language. It helps us make sense of things. It gives us different perspectives. And metaphor is built up by sub-images called metonymies. I won't get too scientific, but let me just say the metaphor, for example, time is money. How does that metaphor play out in our language and in how we present? Well, it plays out when you say, you're wasting my time, or it cost me a lot to go to London, or I've invested in this project, or this is going to save you hours. So we have all these ways that we build on this metaphor of time is money that actually makes us live it. And so really within our organizations, what Gareth Morgan was saying is the way we look at our organizations becomes how they are constructed. But what I've also been looking at is how these images of our organizations also influence our images of resilience. So I'm going to run through, he's got 8 metaphors. I'll run through each of them. And this is really just to give you a provocation. And then we can kind of have some interaction at the end. But Gareth Morgan's first image was of organizations as machines or resilience as a machine. And really, if you think about a machine, you talk about the nuts and bolts, putting a spanner in the works, cogs in a wheel. Machines are fixed or broken. Organizations that adopt this, just to say, no metaphor is absolute, right? So resilience, organizations who may act as a machine largely doesn't mean that they don't have other components, but it's the stronger image that this allows us to look at. So if your organization is operating in this way, you may have very rigid hierarchical structures. You may have managers who are, because of that image, are encouraged to have effective performance, fixed people, and employees are the cogs in the wheel who need to be fixed, who need to keep the machine turning, etc. And the problem with this image, so if you think about this in resilience, you can think about this as actually the wing of a plane. Okay, a wing of a plane has quite a rigid structure even whilst it is flexible. You don't want it to change form. We don't want it to become a boomerang. So, if you look at the resilience of that, it has a very mechanistic way in which it operates. Doesn't mean there's no judgment on any of these things. It's just for us to look at. But seeing a human, in terms of that rigidity, that isn't who we are. And so this metaphor, whilst it gives us some understanding of what we may be expecting, people to be resilient, to bounce back, to pick up and go, it puts a demand that doesn't take account of the human element. So really this moved on to looking at an organism as opposed to a machine. So thinking that things exist within an ecosystem. So the organism has its own system, but it lives in an environment. And within that environment, it looks at adapting. If you think about this in the work context, you can think about companies as organisms and individuals as parts of that. So survival of the fittest is one of the things that often comes in, whether they survive or die. So there's a kind of a living or dead. So there's two opposites in obviously these images. But there's obviously something in this image of resilience as an organism that allows us to see more of a human in an environment, living and looking at how to survive and thrive. And what we look at considering as HR or as leadership is really what are the conditions that enable that flourishing. His third metaphor was really as brain. So really this took account of the fact that we are all capable of learning, we all process information, we are creative, but we can be rational, responsive to feedback. And this obviously has some value because as we go through, we know that we can learn tools that allow us to develop further or not, but it obviously also has limitations. If you are in a silo and you don't have the information outside of you, you're very restricted to only the flow in your particular brain system. So this has a very limited picture. Of course, culture became and is and remains the strongest influence or desire that companies want to look at as resilience. And resilience as a culture, of course, is where we have a collective commitment to everybody around us, but everybody around us who is part of our vision and part of our mission. And sometimes this actually gets equally fixed and exclusive, right? So it limits diversity. An example, we worked with a company that did sportswear, manages or sells sportswear, and staff always had to come in and wear that sportswear. And it was like they had to put on this image, wear this, you know, there was no other choice around that. And so you're either in or you're out sometimes with culture. And that's one of the things that we look at in terms of resilience, and particularly going cross-culturally and having more diversity. And I think it's one of the big pieces of HR today is looking at diversity and inclusion, and how does culture not become limiting and exclusive. Resilience is political system. So this is interesting in terms of how companies operate and how people experience their companies. One of the things that has emerged is that where a company expects a person to bring their own resilience to work, and therefore nothing the company does is considered as impacting on the resilience of that person. It often sets up a power system, a situation where employees don't necessarily want to say they're not resilient, don't want to come forward with mental health challenges or not coping. So, you know, having a political system in action can really separate and divide where your employees are from where your company image is. And here we see that interactions become political ones, and individuals are then having to be gatekeepers, or they just become non-voters and they are clock watchers and they're not engaged, and so your engagement suffers in this sort of image. This one is really, so these last two you can see are quite dark metaphors that came out of Gareth Morgan's work. And resilience of psychic prison, you know, this is where, and I guess in COVID and now particularly with the back to work, we're seeing some of this where people are saying, I'm not going to be so constrained and restricted. You know, to have to be sentenced to a place where I have to do something that is not serving my life, but I can't afford to leave. So again, this is a way and a time when people disengage, and seeing the company as being too restrictive, too despotic. You know, it supports, if you like, the political system in terms of employee disengagement. Resilience is flux and transformation. So a lot of you, not all of you, actually most of you chose the bee colony, but some of you did choose the caterpillar, which obviously evidences this image, right, of flux and transformation, of metamorphosis, of dynamic equilibrium, which, you know, can sometimes be chaotic, but equally has a lot of flow and fluidity. And this is really probably where a lot of people are seeing the world of work moving to, is how do we build in this flux and transformation, the adaptiveness, the regenerativeness, the imaginativeness, the willingness to go through all the cycles of life, if you like, caterpillar to butterfly, and recognizing that none of them are less than, but that they are parts of an evolving process. It also speaks to really having wisdom in the system. So better than the machine, where it was, you know, the operators were the ones who just had to do what the managers were doing. Here, actually, every stage has its own role, and seeing the uniqueness of each employee's contribution to the whole is part of this. And then the last one, and this is really a terrible one, looking at resilience as an instrument of domination. Now, you know, a lot of people say, well, this isn't part of resilience. Interestingly, in part of the organizations I work with are social development. You know, from a charity, so the social development world is one that I know. And a lot of the narrative in terms of the development world, and we see this in a lot of the injustice, somebody mentioned justice as part of resilience. Actually, the development, the age narrative has moved from seeing victims who needed to be helped to seeing people as being resilient and responsible for their own improvement or betterment. And that this has been interpreted by some as a systemic domination, you know, that we accept the status quo and that actually imposes values that don't allow us to change. So if you like, the Elon Musk come back to work or you're fired is an example of this kind of, that's the rule, take it or leave it, and you won't live here if you know, if that's what you choose. So these are really the 8 metaphors that Gareth Morgan used. There are interestingly some others, but you know, I've been looking at these, and actually what's interesting is you can interpret all of these as elements of culture. And so that's partly what we've been doing with organizations and companies, is saying, what is the predominant culture in your organization? Which metaphor is showing itself? And what is that leading to by way of challenges? And how are you needing to, and how are you able to balance that in terms of alternative strategies? So that's really how this has proved useful, is that these are all, as somebody said, it's hard to choose because they all have some element that we can see in where we go. And so grappling and navigating the way through in a way that increases engagement is obviously what our challenge is. So over to you for 1 minute. I'm going to ask you now, if you currently think of the place you work or the organization that you engage with, if you are a recruitment person, then obviously it may be another organization, but if you think of where you work, which of these metaphors do you think predominates in your workplace on a daily basis? Which would you say comes out as maybe just edging above the others? Wow, I want to work where you work, you guys. That's good to see. Yeah, machine and industrial revolution, that's what we've known. And I suppose organism is humanistic behavior of the, I feel for you, number 5. Yeah. So nobody at a typical example, Goldman Sachs, the psychic prison here and just in the engine until you can retire. I say that with all due respect to Goldman Sachs, but it is the example that's often used. Flux and transformation, getting a few more. Brain. Often in networked organizations, in IT organizations, that is often the one that comes through, different components of a so I'm really interested in, and if anybody has any comment about this, how the Great Resignation speaks to people having perceived their work as a psychic prison and having had COVID as the way to move out of it. Is sort of one of the interesting sub-questions in my work. So anybody else, that's 17 who's who voted there. Any other thoughts? Anybody else want to vote? So, okay, then I'm going to ask you now, how would you like to see these? Which one of these would you like? Which would be the top choice? Culture. Definitely culture. And clearly a culture of flux and transformation is as a way of operating. Okay. Anybody want to say please put your comments in the chat if there's anything you want to add about this. So to a large extent, sorry, you're all supporting my work inadvertently, but culture is obviously, I think, the place where we can do the most, and that all of the ones below can be part of the culture is where it becomes so critical for us to start understanding how the culture manifests, how it needs to suit the organization and the individuals within that organization. And I think this is the challenge for HR today, is really working with the individuals who form part of that collective and looking at how they match. And you know, we often talk about culture fits, but that also is a dangerous thing. We've got to look at culture synchronicities and culture cooperations, because we are multicultural, and so how we take account of some people operate in their own capacity as an organism or as a brain or politically, and that is part of the culture. So this has been part of the interesting thing that we are exploring with companies, and if anybody is interested in being part of this or working on this in terms of their own companies, please go through Jo, and she would, I'd be very happy to talk further. So I'm going to come back to your thoughts on these three in particular. Nobody chose the tomato. Some people chose the egg, and I was surprised about that, actually, because obviously Humpty Dumpty is an example of how you can, you know, break into pieces. And so anybody who wants to comment on why they chose the egg, of course, some people have said one thing about the egg is you can put it in hot water and it gets particularly hard and can survive and even be nutritious and nourishing. So, you know, that's the one takeaway I've had on an egg. And obviously the tennis ball, I have a puppy, so tennis balls don't last 10 minutes in my house, so there's no resilience in a tennis ball here, but it is the epitome of the bouncing back. But just to talk about the tomato for a moment, and to maybe have you think about resilience in a slightly different way. The green tomato is particularly hard and resists actually pressure in order that it can develop the fruit and particularly the seeds of that tomato. As the tomato ripens and it softens and it squishes into this tomato, it seeds a whole lot more tomato plants. It's kind of it's the basis of future life and more tomatoes in a cycle of life. And I think that also speaks to this kind of container for the collective in terms of the tomato holding the future tomatoes, holding the seeds, holding the energy that gives it life, but also getting to a point where it needs to change, that kind of agility, that dynamic life cycle process. So I share that with you just to maybe, and of course somebody spoke about how tomatoes are the basis of every pasta sauce pizza base that we know. So and they are one of the most consumed products. But just to let you think about how resilience really manifests differently at different times within a collective. And then some people have spoken to this. So obviously that the bees make honey. There was the comment about the queen bee. If the queen bee is not there, the drones are not supported. Well, I've been fascinated to learn more about bees, and particularly that bees, they are not only drones and soldier bees and whatever. They are bees, a sect, if you like, or a caste, for want of a better word, of bee that's called a winter bee. And I love this phrase when I think about the people who support me as who are my winter bees. Winter bees, their function is to keep the colony warm in the winter. And the picture on the right-hand side shows you a thermal image of what is inside a bee colony in the snow in winter. And what happens is these bees fly around the center of around the outside of the hive, in the inside of the hive, but around the outside of the colony. And they fly at such a speed that they generate temperatures of up to 27 and 30 degrees Celsius. And as they get tired, they move to the inside of the circle and others go out. And winter bees are a particular type of bee. They're born particularly fat and with stores, and they don't really ever go outside the hive. That's where they live and that's what they function to do. But when the hive gets too big, the queen lays another queen, actually. And half of the bees separate and create a bee ball around this queen and move her to her own hive. They have literally had seeker bees or drone bees find a place and they move her. So there's an image here for me of collective resilience, of how we actually have each of our own functions that really each supports the other. And so far from it being at the kind of queen is the basis of everything, actually there's such a much more integrated picture within a colony of bees that shows us how to operate collectively, which I think is a lovely metaphor in terms of how we can build resilience. And then lastly, of course, somebody spoke to the caterpillar and the butterfly. This has been for me a really interesting, it speaks to the flux and transformation, it speaks to the notion of metamorphosis. I don't know how many of you may know, but a caterpillar has within it certain cells that are called imaginal cells. And these cells are DNA separate from the caterpillar. And in fact, there is no DNA shared between the butterfly and the caterpillar. It's quite a fascinating insight that I don't know that many people know. I haven't certainly found as I discovered this. And what happens is when the caterpillar gets to a certain weight where it's life in this form, these imaginal cells start meeting each other and the caterpillar goes into the cocoon. And why the caterpillar goes into a cocoon is because it thinks these imaginal cells are an invasion. And the cocoon is the immune response. The cocoon is hunkering down, and there's literally a war between the caterpillar's DNA and the imaginal cells. And if that caterpillar resists long enough, the imaginal cells won't develop, and you'll have one of those defunct pupas that you see never comes to fruition. But if the imaginal cells are able to collect and come together, they actually create the birth of the butterfly. And so there's really something in that image about how resilience is a mix of resistance and actually just transformation, a willingness to really take a new form and to understand how we need to adapt. And we've seen this in companies, Kodak, Blockbusters, companies who didn't do the adapt structure. But we actually also need to see it with regard to our human resources. And this is a perfect moment, I think, for us to start looking at how do we work differently and how do we change the structure and really allow something new to emerge that isn't a bouncing back, but that is actually a change, a transformation. And in fact, in the Metamorphosis of the World, he talks about the word metamorphosis as opposed to change, that actually we often think of change and that is just tweaking the edges, whereas what we need to do is fundamentally shift the system. And so that's really what we try and look at with companies in terms of change management, how to engage employees at and where they're at and where they meet with the company in terms of sort of empowerment of potential. So I don't know if that is useful, but we basically have used this understanding and these insights to really make sense of, we work with a tool called SenseMaker and really make sense of what is happening in companies with employees and with individuals, not only companies, organizations that are social profits as well. And then look at what are the strategies that we can use to support the change management of that process. And for me, I think HR is, it's been a chief human resource officers have really borne the brunt, I think, of a lot of COVID in the middle of people and management. And yet, I think this is an opportunity for that role to be seen as much more strategic, much more advocacy based in terms of really looking at the opportunities that enrich and enliven the potential. So that's really the kind of world readiness that we look at trying to encourage and build within organizations. So Joe, that's my email address. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm not used to the webinar format, so I feel very much like I've been talking at you all. I'm sorry about that. But I'm very happy to be open to questions or comments or any sort of further feedback. And yes, Jo will send the slides out, and she has done a recording. So maybe Jo, I'll hand over to you and I'll stop sharing my screen, shall I?
Okay, thank you. So thanks very much for attending today's session. I will send some correspondence out this afternoon to everyone that's signed up for the event, and I will put a post on LinkedIn. So if you can put a comment on the LinkedIn post, then that would be much appreciated. Just to let you know that we are part of a bigger group where we have accountancy recruit and finance director recruit within the group if anybody is recruiting in those areas. Otherwise, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to Tamsin. Thanks very much for all the effort that they've put in. And also thanks very much to the listeners for tuning in. Bye-bye.